After waiting for the hordes to die down, I've just been to see the latest James Bond film, No Time to Die. Now, like most British males, at least of a certain age, I've always looked forward to a new instalment of the exploit of the British super spy 007. But although seeing some of the trailers, I've been careful not to read any reviews, nor ask any friends whether they had seen it. And the reason for this was twofold. Firstly, and obviously, I didn't want them to blurt out anything and spoil the entire plot, which is incidentally precisely what I'm going to be doing in this video, so if you haven't seen it, but are planning to, I'd come back to this post after you've been. But secondly, I was specifically avoiding anybody's opinion, judging by the trailers, on how woke it might be. A signature of the Bond franchise is to open up with a bang before the credits, and this one didn't disappoint, although it was an extended opening sequence which might have seemed overlong were it not for the fact that the film is getting on for 3 hours running time. But within this segment there was extensive use of the Aston DB5, which I always consider to be a prerequisite for a satisfying Bond film, complete with smoke screens, retractable machine guns and ridiculously improbable bulletproof glass. So far so good. But then, as with previous outings, Bond has once again gone into a 5-year retirement in some far-flung paradise, this time in Jamaica. This kind of playing around with time is unavoidable, since Bond was already in his late 30s when the original Casino Royale was published in 1953, which would make him at least 105 years old by now, so a certain amount of tweaking is not only understandable, but necessary. And it is in Jamaica that he is offered a lift by a statuesque black woman who offers him a lift on her moped in a Jamaican Creole when his Land Rover won't start. And it is this woman, played by Lashana Lynch, who was the source for the rumours of 007 going woke, as she drops the Caribbean twang and reveals herself to be a 00, sent by M to seek him out. Now, I wasn't all that bothered by another 00 being black, as some are, but I didn't think it necessary that she needed to be a woman. I thought that was unnecessarily woke. Having said that, at 5 feet 9 inches and somewhat powerfully built, without looking like a Soviet weightlifter, she seemed credible, although she spent most of the action sequences shooting people rather than beating up men significantly bigger and heavier than herself. But her inclusion, to coin a phrase in the film, only potentially becomes an issue by implication at the end of the film, which I'll come to later. As you know, I'm not in the habit of reviewing films, but the phenomenon of James Bond is an enduring slice of British culture, and, dare I say it, a potent example of what might be called British soft power. The genius of Ian Fleming's creation was that it gave Brits a hero and an archetype to aspire to, when our image of ourselves as a great power was quite obviously being eclipsed by the United States. And the books gave a glimpse into the kind of life that a bicycle-riding steelworker from Sheffield or a lowly clerk in an insurance office in Norwich could only dream of. I've read a couple of the early Fleming novels, and in one of them, Thunderball I think it was, his description of eating lobster in first class on a transatlantic TWA Lockheed Constellation would have seemed impossibly glamorous in the austere Britain of the early 50s, when wartime rationing remained a reality. But come to think of it, in the era of COVID, the very idea of even taking a transatlantic flight is again starting to feel pretty exclusive. But I digress. So Bond was important culturally. Of course it was always a fantasy. How many spies drive Aston Martins? But the idea was that he was hiding in plain sight, but with the glare of wealth to conceal his intentions. Fleming had worked for British intelligence, so he knew some of what he was talking about. But Bond, of course, never does anything as pedestrian as paperwork, so he was able to eschew all the dreary, mundane tasks that must have been the lion's share of working even for MI6 before the advent of computers. These days, sitting in front of a computer terminal, being a pathetic peeping Tom, must now be all that they do. So much for glamour. Without going too much into the plot, which involves a sort of DNA-based weapon that can be directed specifically at individuals or even ethnic groups. This weapon had been developed by Bond's nemesis, Blofeld, but was secretly continued by MI6 boss M, played by Ray Fiennes, because of the potential for a weapon that promises zero collateral damage. Of course, the lab is raided and the weapon falls into the hands of a new supervillain, Safin, played by Rami Malek. Now this is all getting a bit too close to home, what with all the scare stories and fears regarding the COVID vaccines and their theoretical potential, either to lead us all onto a pharmaceutical treadmill that we cannot escape once on the hook, or that there is serious malice involved, and that the reason that so many public officials around the world seem so dementedly determined to get every single one of us jabbed is because they are there to slowly poison us to death, or to interfere in a diabolical way to render us incapable of reproducing. Of course, the making of No Time to Die predated the whole COVID insanity spasm, so we can't assume that the writers were in any way influenced by events in the real world. But this is not the first Bond film to, if not actually explore, then at least touch upon current issues. The previous outing, Spectre, set itself up rather surprisingly in opposition to overwhelming invasive state surveillance, which is quite something for a spy film, I would have said. Not that it made any difference to the general public's apathy to having unseen eyes watching their every move. Very little seems to make any difference to that. Despite George Orwell's magnum opus, as well as numerous films and books like Colossus, The Forbin Project, the Tom Cruise vehicle Minority Report, and the British film Viva Vendetta, which I also watched again recently and was struck by the eerily accurate portrayal of a brutal fascist Britain run by insane megalomaniacs after the population had willingly surrendered their freedom. Nothing seems to make any difference. At least nothing until COVID, that is. One of the very small positives that has come out of this political nightmare is that it has flushed out quite a number of people who seem to think like me. People who really know what freedom is, and more importantly, what it isn't. But as with so much of what's happened these past 19 months, there is so much more bad news than good. It's true that I've discovered that I am not alone, but I have also discovered that I am in the minority. I am outnumbered. Outnumbered, it seems, by people who do not know or even care what freedom is. People who I would previously have presumed to value it, cherish it, and just generally have felt rather fortunate to have had a free country in which to grow into an adult in, as well as raise their children in. I am outnumbered by people who have always surrounded me, and who I might have imagined that, when push came to shove, and our free society was threatened, would join me in defending it, willingly, just as they did 80 years ago. But push has very definitely come to shove, or will do very soon, and they are nowhere to be seen. The majority of my compatriots, direct descendants as they may be of the heroes of the Battle of Britain, of the Hunt for Bismarck, of El Alamein, of D-Day, of Arnhem, of the Atlantic convoys, of the admin box and the final gruelling drive to Berlin, seem to have decided that the free country that has fed and watered them all their days is less important than their job, their social standing, their trip to the pub on a Friday night, and even their annual 2 weeks in the sun. So the uplift that I get from connecting and communicating with so many like-minded souls is more than cancelled out by the fact that I now know that my countrymen seem to no longer have it in them to be heroes. Or perhaps I should say, since I myself have no idea of whether I have it in me to be a hero, that they show no interest in even the idea of being heroes. They are no more or no less ordinary than the World War II generation, but somehow the distance of the intervening 75 years has made us all smaller men. Small men with small lives, and crucially, a smaller image of ourselves. I can have no real idea of what those men 3 generations back thought of themselves, but I can't shake the feeling that, in order to do the extraordinary things they did, they must have thought more of themselves. They must have thought in a fashion that the modern Brit just doesn't. They must have thought heroically. And this is a devastating revelation to me, for it effectively demolishes my patriotism. My feeling, angered and stimulated and provoked by Brexit, that we were big enough men to shape our own destiny, whatever the resistance. But Brexit came, eventually, and we rejoiced. At last we were released from our political bondage, free to succeed and free to prove the doubters wrong. And even before it had a chance to lift off, COVID hit. And now here we are, as a perpetually furious bloke I follow on Twitter put it, Brexit heroes to lockdown zeros. And so where does James Bond 007 Licence to Kill fit in all this? That's a good question, and one that is answered in No Time to Die. He doesn't. James Bond is dead, killed off at the end of the movie in a Royal Navy missile strike on the supervillain's generic hollowed out volcano. Survived by his lover and his newly revealed 5-year-old daughter. Survived also by M, Moneypenny, Q, and curiously by the new 007, since Lynch, it is revealed earlier in the film, has inherited his 00 number. Make of that what you will. So, do I think this is all a conspiracy? Do I think that Klaus Schwab and his World Economic Forum hatched the dastardly plot to crush our morale by removing our most potent cultural export? Do I think that? Well, no. No, I don't think that. But considering how much Schwab looks, sounds, and on occasion dresses like a Bond villain, you've got to admit it's not impossible. Maybe he really is the megalomaniacal supervillain some of us believe him to be, with an easily bruised ego to match. It's a funny proposition, at least. But I do get the feeling that it's just one more little detail that is drip-fed us, like Chinese water torture, so to speak, to cement in us the impression that we in the West, particularly us in Britain, and specifically us in England, are just finished. We're washed up, pathetic. As it is for Bond, so it is for us, a time to die. I don't believe, as some do, that the scamdemic was dreamt up in some way to punish us for Brexit, to stamp down hard on our aspirations for national renewal and self-determination, perhaps as a warning to others. If that was the case, why is Australia, New Zealand, Italy, Lithuania and Canada, to name but a few, getting the totalitarian cost so much harder than us, at least at the moment? But if you do believe the credible idea of a transnational one-world government, the forceful welding together of previously independent countries into entities like the European Union would be a likely stepping stone to such an arrangement. As it is, Brexit might have been more of a spanner in the works than even we realised at the time. Those were big plans of big players that we might have foiled, and they're not used to not getting their own way. But are we finished? Let's look at us in Britain in a dispassionate way. One of the reasons that so many encourage us to believe that is because Britain is so much less of an influence and a power than it used to be. But that doesn't mean that we're finished, any more than Norway, Argentina or Iran is finished. At the height of empire, which was actually in the 1930s, Britain governed almost a full quarter of the world's population and a quarter of the world's land surface. The great powers of today, the USA, China and Russia, and of the near future, India and Brazil, are huge countries with huge populations. Britain was top dog for over a century when it had only 1% of the world's population. What other country could say that? I'm not saying this in a tub-thumping way, but merely to illustrate that Britain's current status is now much more appropriate to its size. It was the empire days that were the aberration. And anyway, Britain's more modest position in the world is not actually that modest either, being the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, despite being only 21st in terms of population. But whilst it's undeniable that there has been a decline, Britain still punches well above its weight. But then this kind of thing really is just a pissing contest. It isn't what really matters. I mean, are Brits any better, or even happier than Danes, for instance, who come in at a relatively lowly 36 in the list, but frequently top the happy list? No, of course not. And judging by the reports of people who have been to Denmark, I haven't, it sounds like a lovely place. But what is it that matters? It's certainly not where your own particular country sits on the GDP list. Maybe it's just because I'm 54 years old and grew up in the reality of the Cold War, with the memories of the real war, to buttress the idea that we were in some way better than them. Not because we were better human beings, for no sensible person believes that, but because we were raised better in that we were products of our institutions that had been formed by values that were better than theirs behind the Iron Curtain. And chief of these values, far beyond all others, was that we were free, and they weren't. We didn't have to produce our papers to a policeman upon demand, and they did. And not only could we feel smug and superior about that, but that we should, most of all, just feel bloody grateful for it. And I imagine that would have been as true for Denmark as it was for us. And now our institutions are as corrupt as they come. They may not be corrupt in the brown envelope with 2,000 quid in it and nobody needs to know way that we often think of as corruption. Although I reckon if any investigator worth his salt were allowed to do some digging, I think that any notions of Britain being an incorrupt country would vanish overnight. But what I mean is that the institutions have been degraded to such an extent that they are now incapable of performing even their most basic functions. Incapable even if there were the political will, which there quite obviously isn't. And in a so-called free country was the implicit understanding that the individual was important, that he was a citizen and therefore deserving of respect. Of course, there is always a certain amount of communitarianism in any complex society, even the United States. But in a free society, it is freely given. It is not demanded on pain of punishment. And of all the things that I have built my patriotism upon, that idea of the free individual sits right at the pinnacle. And when I acknowledge that, I have to concede that freedom is not a British value per se, but one that is a value of quite a number of countries, or at least it was before March 2020. But that list of countries that remain free is getting smaller and smaller every day. Perhaps the most egregious example of a properly free country that has fallen to totalitarianism is Australia, closely followed by New Zealand and Canada, as well as Wales and Scotland in the UK. France and Italy are faltering too, as is the surprising example of Lithuania, which appears to have forgotten that it was, barely 30 years ago, a puppet state forced into communism by the vastness of the old Soviet Union. So my patriotism, which has been such a guiding light to me for most of my life, can no longer be said to mean anything. The majority of my compatriots appear to have accepted their position as vassals of the state, rather than the employers of their leaders, as they should rightfully be. How can I be a patriot under such conditions? No, the people I now feel kinship with are the countless millions around the world that resist this. Those that say, no, you will not take my rights, under the pretense of seeming to care for others. You will not do it. I will stand in your way and I will take anything you throw at me. Those are my countrymen now, whether they be English, Welsh, Scottish, French, Italian, Canadian, Australian, or indeed Lithuanian. So what has this to do with James Bond? Perhaps nothing, since he is nothing but a fictional character. But also perhaps everything, because he is emblematic of everything I hoped it meant to be British. Strong, fearless, self-sacrificing, capable and loyal. Loyal to his country and to the values it champions. That loyalty was mocked by Sean Bean's character in GoldenEye, Her Majesty's Loyal Terrier, and self-deprecatingly by Bond himself in Skyfall, Don't Forget Pathetic Love of Country, when teased similarly by Javier Bardem. But the idea of a British super spy battling dastardly villains bent on world domination on behalf of Queen and country all sounds rather hollow when one considers that Her Majesty's government appears to be intent on removing everything that is great about Great Britain. How can we root for Bond when he is working for the supervillains? Maybe it is a time to die. And maybe it's time to live for something else. Something, dare I say it, something international.